Christopher Cerf is an author, record and television producer, composer, lyricist, editor, and co-founder and president of the educational television production company Serious Thinking. Since its first season in 1970, Cerf has played a pivotal role in the creation and production of the Sesame Street television program, and most notably as a regular contributor of music and lyrics. In the process, he has won 2 Grammy Awards and 3 Emmy Awards for songwriting and music production. In 1970, he helped launch the most influential of recent humor magazines, the National Lampoon. The Iraq War Reader is Cerf's 3rd political anthology, his 2nd in collaboration with Mikael Sifry. Christopher Cerf, welcome. Mikael Sifry is senior analyst with Public Campaign, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C., working on comprehensive campaign finance reform. In that capacity, he has published articles and op-eds in the Washington Post, Newsday, The American Prospect, The Hill, Salon.com, intellectualpolitics.com, and many smaller papers and magazines. He is the co-author of Democracy That Works, a chapter in The Next Agenda, Blueprint for a New Progressive Movement, and is currently writing a book on how money and politics affects people in their everyday lives. His book, Spoiling for a Fight, Third-Party Politics in America, was described in Newsday as, quote, a commanding survey of contemporary third parties. In a more politically developed country, Sifry's reporting would be the gold standard of contemporary journalism, unquote. Prior to joining Public Campaign in 1997, Sifry was an editor and writer with The Nation magazine for 13 years, writing widely on domestic and international politics, especially the Middle East, his first love and specialty. He is also the founding member of the Independent Politics Group, which is affiliated with the Political Science Department of the City University of New York Graduate Center, and I'm honored to also be a founding member, and I'm also honored that he's here. I've had the opportunity to work with him for about 3 years on events like this. Please welcome Mikael Sifry.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thank you, President Caputo, and we're very, very grateful to PACE and to Simon & Schuster also, who made the Iraq War Reader possible. Basically, Mika and I have done this once before. We've done a book like this for the last Gulf War, and we had a real sense of deja vu this time, because it seemed that the same kind of problem existed as we saw it in what the public was seeing and hearing as we approached this war that happened the last time, which is basically we had a tremendous amount of coverage, 24-hour-a-day coverage on major television networks, etc. But a lot of that coverage was very much in the moment, and it seemed to us there was almost no discussion of the history of Iraq before all this happened. Even the last war wasn't mentioned that much. And also, basically, what led to the policies, what led to the U.S. And its relationship with Iraq, or the entire West's relationships with the Middle East. These things weren't being discovered in our kind of soundbite mentality. They weren't being discussed. So we felt if we could put into a book some of that background in a very readable way from people who were either experts on the subject or actually helped make the history themselves, or had very strong and informed opinions about it, we could perform a real service and also do something very interesting, which mattered to us because we had to spend the time. And we feel we've done that, and we were able, thanks to many of the people here, all of whom contributed, to really assemble some of the most wonderful writers and thinkers we know and knew of from every possible place on the political spectrum. We kind of look at it as a town meeting in print, and the only problem with doing a town meeting in print is you eventually have a deadline and they take your typewriters and computers away, and so you have to turn the book in. And we were sorry when that happened, but thanks to Pace College and Pace University and to others, we can keep that town meeting going with events like this. And so we're really glad we could be here, and I'm going to turn it over to Mika now to tell you how we're going to work this today.
Thanks, Chris. Let me start out by thank you. Let me start out by apologizing for those of you who originally heard about this event when it was first advertised. You may have heard that William Crystal, the editor of the Weekly Standard, was going to be one of our 4 panelists. And unfortunately, a few days ago, he had to pull out. He sends his apologies, but his new book was just translated into French, and so he's off to Paris, France, which we refer to as Paris Freedom, to to do a book tour there. So, but his loss is our gain because we were very lucky. We were very lucky on such short notice to be able to get Saad Eddin Ibrahim to join our panel, and this is his first public appearance, if I understand correctly, since coming to the United States and needing to have some surgery. And we were very, very grateful that he was able to come. We're also very happy that we have such a diverse panel. It is our best effort to reflect the diversity of voices on this very difficult set of issues. 9/11, Iraq, empire, and democracy. Obviously, there are no black and whites in this discussion. And we are hoping here for a chance to have some civil debate and inquiry that will include you, the audience, as participants in asking questions towards the latter half of the program. We will invite you to put questions on index cards and hand them up, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible. We're also going to invite the students who are here for this week-long program to have a chance to ask a couple of questions. But first, we're going to hear from our four panelists. We've asked each of them to speak for a couple of minutes, and then Chris Cerf and I will hopefully ask some pointed questions, and they'll have a chance to ask each other a question. To give this discussion some focus, since 9/11, Iraq, empire, and democracy just about covers everything, we asked our panelists to focus on two specific things. One is the future of Iraq in the wake of the war, and the other is the future of America's role in the world, which obviously has taken some kind of a qualitative leap, or at least some people think it has. And so we're hoping that, yes, we will inevitably get into the debates of the last year, but that at least we will have a forward thrust. We are trying to look ahead to the future. The order of the speakers was determined by picking cards from this deck. No, actually it wasn't. The order of the speakers are Saad Ibrahim, who will be followed by Jonathan Schell, then Chris Tunsing, and then batting cleanup Christopher Hitchens. So let me introduce our first speaker. Saad Eddin Ibrahim is a professor of sociology at the American University in Cairo and the founder in 1988 of the Ibn Khaldun Center, which is a research and advocacy center focused on democratization and civil society. In the summer of 2000, he and 27 of his colleagues were arrested as they prepared to monitor the upcoming parliamentary elections in Egypt. All 28 were found guilty by a state security court, and several were sent to jail. Dr. Ibrahim himself was sentenced to a 7-year term. He and his colleagues fought back in the courts, and their cases provoked worldwide condemnation. On March 18th of this year, I'm happy to say, Egypt's highest court acquitted him and 2 of his fellow defendants of all charges. The ruling also sets forth some broad principles of law and cautioned the executive branch of government in Egypt to refrain from usurping excessive powers. Among the points made in the ruling are the rights of researchers to investigate and report on social problems in the country, the right of citizens to freedom of expression, and the right of lawful organizations to accept funding from non-Egyptian sources. It's really quite a privilege to have Dr. Ibrahim here with us, and I'm looking forward to what he has to say. I give you Dr. Saad Ibrahim.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and forgive me for not being able to stand up. The very broad title of this panel is very telling. I cannot address every item in the title. But I want to start from where this kind of introduction ended, my acquittal from charges in Egypt's highest court. That very episode tells us all about the drama that's going on in the Middle East right now. A fight between new forces that are trying to democratize the region, to establish equitable peace, and old forces, authoritarian, totalitarian forces that have ruled for so long and are determined to continue to rule. This fight, therefore, was not a personal fight. It really was a fight between these two set of forces in my region, not just in Egypt, but in the entire Middle East. Because there are other people in Syria, in Iraq, of course, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Palestine, who have gone through similar struggle to establish the rule of law, to establish democracy, to work for peace. The fact that I was sentenced to 7 years in jail, the fact that I fought back with my colleagues and finally got an acquittal, tells you exactly the size of the battle. It is not a hopeless battle. It is a battle that can be fought. It is a battle that can be won. And therefore, when we talk about the future of the Middle East, we have to keep that in mind. There are as many factors, as many elements that can push the region toward peace and democracy as there are that can set it back toward war, violence, terrorism, and oppression. My second remark has to do with Iraq itself, a country that I had the privilege of living in for a couple of years back in the 70s. A country with great assets, with great people, with great tradition, great civilization. However, it is one of those countries in the Middle East that has been bedeviled by one of the worst dictators in history, Saddam Hussein. I was against the war, but I was happy about the outcome of the war. This may not be a very popular position to take back home, but I took it. I said, with the region, less one dictator, I am happier. And I will be happier when all the dictators in the Middle East disappear. I and other like-minded, are fighting for that. We have no illusion about how long it will take. We have no illusions about the kind of democracy we'll have. It will not be a Westminster democracy. It will not be a congressional democracy. It will be a little bit messy. It will be difficult. It will be agonizing. But it will be far better than we have had for the last 50 years. And on that score, an activist does not look at all the negative factors that work against democracy. I work as those positive factors that can help democracy. And I am determined, with others, to make those factors, even if they represent 20, 30, 40% success elements, we are determined to make them a majority. We are determined to make them prevail and to bring about democracy. My third point has to do with the peace in the region. I'm gratified that there is a summit meeting today in Sharm el-Sheikh, in my country, that President Bush has finally decided to get involved and to work for peace. I hope it will work. I will work with other minded peace activists in the region to make it work. And it is up to you to help us in this drive. I think peace and democracy are twin objectives without which this region will continue to take the world to the brink of war every 7 years. I calculated from 1945 to 2003, how many times has this region been a theater for armed conflict? 10 times in less than 50 years. 10 times. Starting with the Marine landing in Lebanon back in 1958. This is the involvement of the United States alone. And if you want to avoid another war, if you want to avoid another bin Laden, if you want to avoid another Saddam Hussein, then you have to work for peace and democracy in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ibrahim. It's really inspiring to have you here and to hear you speak. And we have a wonderful second speaker that we would like to introduce now, Jonathan Schell, whom I'm sure most of you know as a Nation columnist for many years and author of important books, many that you know, the most recent of which is The Unconquerable World, Power, Violence, and the Will of the People. Jonathan was born here in New York and became known reporting on the Vietnam War for the New Yorker magazine. That's when I first heard of him. And he wrote a book, as you may know, called The Village of Ben Souk, which had an immense impression on me when I was starting out my career at Random House. Jonathan was the principal author of the Notes and Comment column in the New Yorker for many years. He writes for The Nation and for Harper's and Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic Monthly, you name it. He's taught at Emory, he's taught at Princeton and NYU and Wesleyan, and he's a Harold Willens Peace Fellow at the Nation Institute. He's currently living in New York, and we're honored to have him here today. Jonathan, you want to come up here?
I have to amend one thing that Chris said. The subtitle of my book is Power, Nonviolence, and the Will of the People.
That was a bad mistake.
It gives you a clue to what I will now be saying. I want to add that it's an honor to appear here today with Professor Ibrahim, who has lived what he believes, and it's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to say also that, as it happens, I live 6 blocks from here, also 6 blocks from where the World Trade Center once stood. And I guess it's impossible not to think of that on this day. In fact, it's impossible not to think of it on almost any day. I mention that not because I want to claim any special credential. I don't believe in such credentials. I think we all have a right and even an obligation to talk about things that we haven't personally experienced, but we did experience it here very close up in this community. I do mention it because what I want to go on to say is that I think that the United States in its foreign policy has headed off on a fairly drastically wrong track. And at the heart of the debate now unfolding on that policy, it seems to me, is the question of the role of force. Shall we rely chiefly on unilateral force to achieve our ends, or shall we proceed mainly cooperatively and peacefully together with our allies and the rest of the international community? And I think that this question resolves into 2 further questions. And first one is violence the best way to bring democracy to the world? And the second, is violence a suitable instrument for stopping the weapons of mass destruction? You'll recall that these were the 2 chief objectives that were set forth for the war. So let's look at the war so far. And by the way, I'm afraid to say I don't think it's over. In light of these questions, and then look at the deeper question of whether Iraq is going to be a good model for future operations as the administration proposes. The United States won militarily in Iraq, but at the same time lost the world. Both consequences, it seems to me, are harmful to the future of the United States. So first, democracy. The bestial dictatorship in Iraq has fallen, and no one who has watched the people clawing with their hands in mass graves to find some thigh bone or elbow of their relatives can be anything but glad of that. And yet the fact of the matter is that the current administration has never had, does not now have, and shows no signs of having in the future a policy of determining its military interventions on humanitarian grounds. If it did, we'd have 160,000 troops not in Iraq, but in the Congo, where 3 million people are estimated to have died as a result of the conflict there in recent years. But the question remains, nevertheless, whether the U.S. will now build democracy in Iraq and whether it will be able to do so. Not every liberation is at the same time a birth of freedom. I have to see that I see no signs so far of democracy being born in Iraq. Conceptually, the problem is the contradiction of trying to force people to be free. That was Robespierre's mistake in the French Revolution of 1789, and it proved a shortcut to horror. Because the fact is that force and freedom are opposites. Practically, the problem is the one we've seen unfolding on the ground in Iraq. If the United States stands back and does nothing, the result is anarchy. Looted museums, no electricity, no water, gangs taking over the streets. But if the United States steps in, it is the occupying power, a dictatorship, perhaps with the help of some quislings. This rubs local nerves raw, and popular resistance starts. And in fact, it has already started, and about a soldier a day has been killed in the last week or so, American soldier. The falling statue of Saddam was not the end of the war. I'm afraid it may have been the beginning of the war. We speak of a transition to democracy, but this puts a screen of words up to cover what seems to be a far different reality that is emerging. Reality is an increasingly ruthless occupation on one side. You may have noticed that General McKiernan, who's in charge of the troops in Baghdad, was recently moved to declare that American forces exercised absolute power in Iraq. And on the other side of that equation is resistance, including armed resistance movements. The amount of democracy on either side of this equation is so far zero, as far as I can tell. The future is in shadow, as always, but the tradition I see is to a classic war of liberation against the foreign conqueror. And already the administration has canceled the homecoming of thousands of American troops there. It's not a new story. It's the story of the 20th century. In almost every case, the foreign conqueror was driven out. Now, what about weapons of mass destruction? Well, where are they? On March 17th, the president said, "Intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraq regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised." Doubt has crept in. But in actuality, I don't think that's really the point, whether they find the weapons of mass destruction or not. Let's suppose for a moment that they do come up with them tomorrow and dismantle them. The Iraq War was never about weapons of mass destruction only in Iraq. You'll recall that it was about an axis of evil, and beyond that, it was about the problem of non-proliferation in general. And it was meant to teach a lesson. And that lesson was that if you go and get weapons of mass destruction, the United States is going to come in and do regime change on you. Therefore, don't get those weapons. Well, countries did learn a lesson from this war, but it turned out to be exactly the opposite of the one that was intended. Iran learned it, North Korea learned it. And what they learned is, we see regime change coming, we don't care for it, so we will get weapons of mass destruction, and we will prevent it. And by the way, that appears to have worked for North Korea. And the United States is the last country that should be surprised by such a lesson, because in point of fact, for 50 years of the nuclear age, we have ceaselessly taught a single lesson in all of our actions and all of our policies. And that lesson was, if you want to be safe from nuclear weapons, get nuclear weapons. That's the idea that is at the very heart of the idea of deterrence. which even now, even with the addition of the preemptive policy, still remains at the core of nuclear policy. Now, can we really say that these precedents are a good model for the future, for future wars, for dealing with the terrors of the 20th century? Do these results offer a good model for either democratization or for non-proliferation? On the contrary, it seems to me that we have discredited democracy and stepped up proliferation. In both cases, we have turned out to have advanced the law of the jungle. If this is success, I'd like to know what failure would look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm sorry I reversed the title of your book, but maybe, like our book, you can sell to both sides if you change the title. In any case, the next person I want to introduce is named Chris. You may have noticed that just about everybody on this panel or involved in this is named Chris.
No, me.
And this is not the last Chris. You'll have another one to hear from after this. But I'm going to introduce now Chris Tensing, who has been an immense help to us on the Iraq War Reader since we started. He's the editor of Middle East Report, and indeed the director of the entire organization, MERIP, the Middle East Research and Information Project, which for any of you who've done any research on this subject at all will already know this is one of the most valuable resources that we have. It's a wonderful magazine, and it's also a wonderful presence on the web, and has helped us with this book and with our last one too. Chris has lived in Egypt. He's a real expert on the subject firsthand. He's traveled widely in the Arab world. He's fluent in Arabic, which very, very few Americans are, I must say. And that gives him a lot of insights that he otherwise wouldn't have. He's written in Foreign Policy in Focus for the Boston Globe and many other publications, and appears regularly on TV and radio to discuss the Iraq conflict recently, but also the situation in Palestine and Israel, and many other Middle Eastern situations, of which there are only too many. So Chris, please come up and give us your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that very kind introduction, and thanks very much for the opportunity to appear with this very distinguished panel, and thanks not for drawing attention to my relative youth and inexperience in introduction. I want to make some comments that underscore and underline some of the things that Jonathan Schell was saying, if in slightly more polemical fashion. And I'd like everyone to imagine that William Crystal was in fact here, because many of these remarks were written with him specifically in mind. Beginning in mid-February with a massive military buildup underway in the Persian Gulf and heated debates resounding in the halls of the United Nations, the American Enterprise Institute instituted a series of black coffee briefings on the coming war to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. The denizens of this think tank, the prime nesting place of several prominent Iraq hawks, knew that however hollow their arguments may have seemed to the millions of people protesting in the streets and to the majority of the members of the Security Council itself, they had won the day where it counted in the Bush White House. The Iraq hawks knew that Bush and his team had already decided to go to war, despite their occasional protestations to the contrary. If White House spinmeister Ari Fleischer was still serving half-calf double decaf with cream and sugar, telling the sleepy Washington press corps that George W. Bush was a, quote, patient man for whom, quote, war is a last resort, unquote, the Iraq hawks knew it was time to drink their caffeine straight. For Iraq watchers, including those of us who opposed the war, the transcripts of these black coffee briefings offered a few insights into the thinking of Beltway insiders who were close to the architects of this recent war. We learned about how a conquered Iraq fit into their vision of a remade Middle East, how the road to Jerusalem led magically through Baghdad without seeing any West Bank settlements, and how invading U.S. troops would be welcomed with, quote, kites and boomboxes by long-suffering Iraqi civilians, particularly the oppressed Shiite minority, who might even take up arms alongside their liberators. The last black coffee briefing on Iraq took place at AEI on April 22nd. Looking back at the news reports from that week, the think tankers had many interesting puzzles to solve for their audience. Where were Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, which the Hawks had assured us before the war posed a mortal threat to the United States and the free world? Why had the Shiites not risen up en masse to fight the hated Ba'athist regime? And why were many Shiites and their leaders talking about Imam Ali and, quote, occupation instead of Thomas Jefferson and liberation? Instead of clouding the coffee with ruminations on these troubling subjects, Newt Gingrich, the speaker at that particular briefing, delivered a jolt of espresso. Colin Powell was squandering the hard-won gains of the Iraq War by visiting Damascus and foisting upon the hapless Bush a roadmap that led past a few recently parked mobile homes in the West Bank. I mentioned the Gingrich briefing for two reasons. First, because it shows that the Iraq Hawks have always had their eyes on a bigger prize. And more importantly, because of the date, April 22nd. On April 22nd, the Iraq Hawks decided that Iraq was no longer worth talking about. It has become customary to say that the U.S., quote, won the war and is losing the peace in Iraq, but that gives the Bush administration far too much credit. There were never any serious plans to, quote, win the peace in Iraq, only fantasies of succeeding without trying. We are now watching occupiers' amateur hour. There were no plans to hold the non-petroleum-based patrimony of the Iraqi people in trust. U.S. troops stood by while looters destroyed the National Museum. There were no plans to keep the machinery of government and the economy running. U.S. troops watched as looters pillaged government ministries, laboratories, factories, and other places of employment, leaving Iraqis to this day without work. There were no plans to quarantine the components of possible nuclear proliferation. U.S. troops did not stand guard at the facility of Tuwaitha, allowing possible components of nuclear proliferation to be looted. Even some oil fields in the south were looted of key equipment, with the result that Iraq today is pumping slightly more than half the oil it was during the last days of Saddam's regime. There were no serious plans to bring Ba'athist war criminals to justice. U.S. troops loitered in the vicinity while locals excavated the mass grave at Hilla with a steam-powered backhoe, thereby rendering much of the forensic evidence useless for future prosecutions. And a few days ago, on May 18th, U.S. forces released a major suspect in precisely those massacres of Shiites who had risen up after the 1991 Gulf War, a man by the name of Mohammed Jawad al-Nafus, because they were unaware of the charges against him. The only serious plan for the country's post-war indigenous governance was perhaps the dreamiest of the Iraq Hawks' fantasies. And now, finally, less than a month into the occupation, the Iraq Hawks are learning what most independent observers have been saying all along, that Iraq is not a gigantic etch-a-sketch on which the formerly omnipresent murals of Saddam can be erased and doodles of Ahmed Chalabi wearing George Washington's powder wig put in their place. Today, Chalabi's head flak in Baghdad announced that the Leadership Council appointed by Lieutenant General Jay Garner, the now deposed American Viceroy of Iraq, will ignore the new council that's going to be appointed by the new American Viceroy of Iraq, Paul Bremer. So soon, Iraq could have not just one, but two unelected and unrepresentative, quote, interim governments, both installed by American viceroys. The only serious plans to emerge from the U.S. occupation have nothing to do with humanitarian intervention, and everything to do with centralizing the levers of power, governance, oil, and now it seems guns, in the hands of the occupier. Those who lauded the United Nations for refusing to authorize the war are now faced with the uncomfortable reality that the UN has stamped its seal of approval on a U.S.-British occupation of Iraq of indefinite duration with minimal UN involvement and no built-in timeline for the transition to indigenous government. What is to be done? Well, if you're an Iraq hawk, you want to move on to Iran. But I would say that for the rest of us, if we want to talk seriously about building democracy in Iraq, and not just hallucinate about add Ahmed Chalabi and stir democracy, then the large disconnect between the recent consolidation of the U.S. occupation and the war party's pre-war rhetoric is only one of many contradictions for us that we have to deal with. There is a looming contradiction in Iraq between two precepts of democracy as we idealize it, one being self-determination and the other being liberalism, by which I mean such things as respect for civil rights, tolerance of dissent, and mechanisms for the peaceful alternation of power. The questions here are many, and the relevant question for us as Americans, perhaps the most relevant one, is would the U.S. countenance a self-determined Iraq, which had a self-determined foreign policy, which denied the Pentagon basing rights, refused to quit OPEC, and helped the Saudis keep oil prices at their current high levels, and adopted a position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that was closer to Damascus than the one in the Bush White House? Well, that would fly in the face of everything the U.S. wanted to achieve by opposing Saddam. And so one very possible outcome in Iraq when the U.S. occupation does end, and one that we have to be very wary of, is that the Hawks will leave behind in Iraq a U.S.-friendly democracy that has all the trappings of democratic governance, a bicameral legislature, a constitution, regular elections, but has none of the substance of democracy, and is neither liberal nor reflective of popular wishes. We do not want to see the United States leave Iraq with a democracy that looks like the democracy which convicted Dr. Ibrahim and has finally belatedly realized its error.
Thank you, Chris. Our last speaker is Christopher Hitchens, who also probably requires no introduction, but I am going to get the sheet of paper that has his... Christopher Hitchens, who I consider a friend from many years of both working at The Nation magazine, and though neither of us are officially connected with that place, I suspect something of its soul and value still lurks within our hearts. I hope I can say that.
Lurk. Lurk is
maybe.
Lurk is good.
Okay, lurk. Christopher Hitchens is a columnist for Vanity Fair and the author most recently of A Long Short War, The Postponed Liberation of Iraq. A widely published polemicist and frequent radio and TV commentator, the author of many books including Why Orwell Matters, Letters to a Young Contrarian, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, as well as books on Cyprus, Kurdistan, and Palestine, including Blaming the Victims, which he co-edited with Edward Said. He writes for, among others, Slate, The Atlantic Monthly, The New York Times Book Review, and The Washington Post. He lives with his family in the tobacco-friendly city of Washington, D.C. And I just want to, one other personal remark, want to thank him for having been among the very first of the authors Chris Cerf and I called when we got the assignment to pull together this book, and he right away gave permission to us to include two articles, one which reflects Christopher's thinking about the first Persian Gulf War, and one, of course, a more recent one about why he supports regime change. And we really appreciated that vote of confidence, getting that so early, and it was a big help in bringing other authors into the book. So thank you, Christopher, and I give you the podium.
Thank you, man. Thank you, Mika. Thank you, Chris. I also want to claim my share of the distinction of being on the same platform as Professor Ibrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades, in about 9 months' worth of argument now with a faction or a tendency in American politics and life calling itself a peace or anti-war movement, I've never for a day lost my sense of the surreal which has mounted throughout this argument and polemic, and which I don't think has yet crested, though I thought it might crest today when I read yet another series of columns showing with what fury and annoyance the peace movement discovered the evident fact that Saddam Hussein's stocks of deadly weaponry have ceased to exist, or will soon do so. The annoyance at this discovery, I think, crowns my sense of the irresponsibility of this movement. Shall I recall to you that only a few months ago the Saddam Hussein regime itself claimed to be holding enormous stockpiles of toxin and chemical and biological material. That it insisted to the United Nations that it had these, that it confirmed that it had them, and was not understating the case. That it could not and would not prove that it had destroyed them, that it refused even to save its own life to come into compliance with Resolution 1441, which was a 15-0 unanimous vote, the preamble of which mentions the manufacture, distribution, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And that at least half of the occasions on which I debated with the peace movement on podiums up and down the country, I was told that a reason not to have a confrontation with the National Socialist Ba'athist regime in Iraq was that it would use weapons of mass destruction to chronic and deadly effect on American forces, on its neighbors, and on its own population. In other words, if this is an irony, comrades, it's an irony at many people's expense. But one thing we can say, either the Saddam Hussein regime was disarmed, or is disarmed, or very soon will be, and I say that is a fantastically good outcome. Some combination of internationally exerted armed force, or the believable threat of the same, and sanctions, and isolation, and air cover for the insurgent regions of Iraq, principally the northern sixth of the country, roughly contiguous with Iraqi Kurdistan, and the southern, predominantly Shia portion around Basra and the marshes. By the way, all of those no-fly zones were acts of war, not sanctions by the United Nations, but which did prevent the completion of ethnic cleansing in Iraq, mean that I think my title is justified in my book, that this is a war that began in 1990, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, with Saddam's attempt to destroy even the name of another independent Arab Muslim state. Actually, not just to invade and occupy, but to remove from the map the state of Kuwait. And that really the problem has been, in the intervening 12 years, not a rush for war, not a drive to war, not a drumbeat of war, but at least 10 years too much indulgence for a dictatorship so filthy that it was impossible, and so dangerous, and so unstable, and so highly toxic that coexistence with it was morally and politically impossible. Now, I think this fact ought to be confronted and looked at again and held up to the light and shaken and looked at again from every aspect, because if the anti-war movement, sometimes calling itself anti-imperialist movement, peace movement, had had its way, this would not have been the outcome. Indeed, if that political tendency had had its way in general since 1989 and the collapse of Stalinism in Europe, Kuwait would still be the 19th province of Iraq. The ethnic cleansing of Kurdistan would have gone unpunished. Bosnia would now be part of Greater Serbia. Kosovo would be another cleansed, howling wilderness. And the Taliban would still be the government of Afghanistan. Those would be the battle honors of the peace movement, if their advice had been listened to, which fortunately it was not. And this, what I call refusal of responsibility, simple decline of a historical inheritance of responsibility that became evident to many people no later than, let's say, the 11th of September 2001, prompts me to three reflections. Comment on three interlocking international developments. The first is the self-evident fact that there is within the Islamic world a civil war. On one side are those who wish to impose Sharia law on everybody. In other words, not to have not to have states for Muslims, like say Pakistan, but Muslim states, rather a different conception. And to impose this on non-Muslims also, which can be seen from everything from the proposed stoning to death of Amina Lawal in Nigeria and the extension of Sharia law to the northern provinces and now to the central and southern ones as well, a civil war in Nigeria on this point, to Indonesia, to the attempt to destroy secular government and civil society in Algeria, the attempt to import Wahhabi terrorism into Bosnia and Kosovo, and elsewhere. A struggle really intently meant, and of course in Indonesia and Malaysia too. But where there is Islamic resistance, Muslim resistance, civil resistance to this course of action, and where those who hope to win this war for Sharia and for Talibanism hope to do so and to impress and or terrify those who waver in their own society by exporting that war to our society as well, thus making the challenge one that is inescapable. And this has involved the building of a secret army within our own borders, supported by dictatorships outside them, which has every intention eventually of killing everybody in this room and their families. I believe that we can hope, if we exert all our intelligence and all our cultural skill, to make real friends among the Muslim world who don't want this outcome for themselves any more than we do for ourselves, or indeed, as a matter of elementary solidarity and fraternity, for them. So the problem is going to be finding and making allies and making it clear to the other side that their victory is impossible, not morally impossible, physically impossible, that they will be destroyed in the attempt, and that we have no compunction about making that statement in advance, making good on it, and preparing to make it come true. The second tendency to which I'd like to draw attention, and which is what I think finally drew me to the side of the sinister cabal in Washington that believed that Saddam Hussein should go, or at least should not have been reconfirmed in power by the Bush administration in 1991 as a minimum, is this. I do believe that there is a wind of change, a regime change tendency in the region that probably needs it most, the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. I will just have time to instance a few of the cases in point. For me, the most important, and perhaps the one that had the greatest effect on me, was the embryonic creation of an independent, semi-independent, let's say autonomous Kurdistan in the sixth part of Iraq, the 1/6 of the north, that was emancipated from Saddam's control in 1991. In that region, regime change has been demonstrated in practice, despite Mr. Tenzing's extraordinary cynicism on this point, in the most mountainous, backward, tribal, poison-gassed, ethnically cleansed, historically feudal region of Iraq. A real new society has been created. There's more than one party, there's 21 newspapers, there's an enormous diversity of opinion, there's freedom of movement, there are 4 female high court judges, and the oil revenues are spent on the development of the people and the infrastructure, and not on the upkeep of a parasitic, psychopathic military oligarchy. Next door in Iran, all the evidence we have shows that candidates who are opposed to theocracy, who want a civil society, will continue to win every election that is held there. They're not yet allowed to take power, but they can demonstrate that they can win the elections, and we can see the diminishing returns of the attempt to create a boring, backward theocracy out of one of the world's most highly sophisticated cultures. And we can hope, as with all the other cases I mentioned, by the way, that the many millions of talented exiles who've acquired great gifts and qualifications in their enforced exile will and should have the right of return to their countries and the right to contribute their lives and their skills to their own societies, and we should count ourselves on their side and on the side of their right of return. I would instance also the very clear movement among Palestinians for a leadership chosen by themselves and not imposed from the outside by a group of corrupt, poseur, former pseudo-guerrillas, for a leadership also that's answerable in negotiation and cannot simply, if it doesn't like the talks or the proceedings, walk out and say, well, we can always go back to Brother Saddam in Baghdad and reignite our rejectionist option. That option now no longer exists. Good thing, too. Political developments among the Palestinians seem to me to be uniformly healthy and democratic. The collapse of the Turkish attempt to partition, occupy, and annex northern Cyprus, a recent enormous concession made by a government that got itself on the wrong side of this regime change argument, is another case in point, another very inspiring one. Somebody is signaling me that I'm trespassing, not as I'd hoped on my time, but on yours, ladies and gentlemen. I think this is probably as far as I will be able to get, but I'm hoping, I had a third point to make about the evolution of American policy towards client state, towards empire, and towards cultural civil war, and I just hope someone will have the goodness to challenge me on it. Thank you.
Can be done.
Is mic on? Yeah. Okay. Okay. We're going to go into more of a dialogue part of our proceedings now, and Chris Cerf and I are going to try and ask a quick question to each of our panelists as a follow-up, and if they'll take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to answer, If any of the other panelists have a quick rejoinder that they want to make, that's okay, but everyone will get their turn. The first question I want to ask is to Professor Ibrahim. To cite something from Christopher Hitchens' book. He has an essay in his book on imperialism, which appears to argue for a benign imperialism by the United States, that we should be, quote, a superpower for democracy. And he writes, a condition of the new imperialism will be the specific promise that while troops will come, they will not stay too long. An associated promise is that the era of the client state, and I think we could probably include Egypt's current government in that, though Christopher doesn't say so specifically, that the client state is gone and that the aim is to enable local populations to govern themselves. So my question for you, Professor Ibrahim, is, do you think that many Arabs or Muslims in your country or in the region would welcome this kind of American imperialism? Is this a viable notion?
No, I don't think my people in the region or any people anywhere would welcome empires in any form, American or otherwise. They would welcome friends, mature democracies, to help them develop into democracies. But occupation and empire, I think, will be a disaster for the region and for the emperors.
Could I ask one question to follow that up, too? If the democracy or the improvement toward democracy that we're all talking about occurs in Egypt, do you see any chance that an Islamist government might win that democracy or create a situation that is not much better than what we have now?
This is a question I am often asked, and my answer is no. They will not win. The Islamicists will get probably anywhere from 15 to 20% in a country like Egypt. We have tested that empirically. We know it is true. They're just organized. And their 20% of the popular vote can translate probably to as many as 30 or 40% of electoral council votes. This is because they vote as a bloc, they are organized. However, having said that, I think we have to be consistent. We have to respect the rules of the game. Even if they win, I am a secularist, will be willing to live with the outcome. A Democrat must be a Democrat, not only a Democrat if the outcome comes in his fashion or in his size. And therefore, I am one of those who believe that even the Islamicists, let's say the moderate Islamicists who choose to play the democratic game, in the process they seem to moderate and to evolve into Muslim Democrats, like the Christian Democrats of Western Europe. We have seen that happening in Turkey, we have seen that happening in Morocco, we have seen that in Bahrain, in Jordan, and in Yemen. And therefore, let us not use this fear arousal to scare the prospect of democracy in the region.
Thank you. Going in order, I'm going to pose the next question to Jonathan Schell, who, can you hear me? Who ended his speech with a very strong remark about, if this is success, I'd like to see failure. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of the story of the Iraqi man who, to escape being imprisoned by Saddam, hid himself in between the walls of his family's home for 20 years, which was an eerie reminder of Anne Frank. So I'm going to ask you this question. Aren't Iraqis better off today than they were 3 months ago? And if, just to take the analogy to its limit, if an invading power had the ability in 1942 to enter Germany with superior force and to depose Hitler and the Nazis, would we be arguing first over whether that power had the right to do so, if international law allowed it to do so, if it was just after Germany's coal, if it was giving plum reconstruction contracts to the cronies of its president, or wouldn't we first be celebrating that the concentration camps were shut down?
And let me take the questions in reverse order. In regard to the latter, of course, we did our very best to do that. We mounted a war on air, land, and sea against Nazi Germany. It wasn't possible actually to go in there and overthrow that government until a lot else had been done first, and that was great for a whole variety of reasons. But the analogy between Hitler and Saddam Hussein seems to me to break down at 4 out of 5 points. Hitler represented perhaps the greatest military power of his time. He was able to conquer all of Europe. Saddam Hussein was an immensely reduced power. What does remain the same is, well, actually, probably Saddam Hussein was a worse internal dictator than even Hitler. Hitler killed people mostly outside of his own country in the conquered countries, and especially the Jewish population. But I'm afraid to say that not only has the United States not had a policy of targeting and overthrowing governments because they are dictatorships, but I think it has been wise not to have such a policy. I think that there are times when the use of force is justified. I think it's when it reaches the point of crimes against humanity. But I don't think that this was the most motivation at all of the United States. If you'll recall, when Saddam Hussein actually was committing crimes against humanity, the United States was sending him anthrax. So it's a little late in the game for us to get worked up about that. We should have stopped it when it could have been stopped, and there were people who tried that, but our administration, the Reagan administration in that case, covered it up and would do nothing. We do have experience of what brings democracy in this world. After all, the last 2 decades of the 20th century saw the birth of 20 to 25 democracies. In the former Soviet lands, there were 5 or 10 right there, the Philippines, Greece, Spain, Portugal, etc., etc., etc. What did it, amazingly, and it's hard to believe it even today, was massive nonviolent movements by the peoples of those countries. Democracy in its very nature is a homegrown product. It is not something that can be imposed from without. And if you want to understand why there's looting in Iraq rather than the building up of some kind of democracy, the answer is that the will for the change of that regime, the active positive will, came from the United States. You did not have a situation in Iraq. Perhaps they was just simply too brutal. I'm not blaming anybody, of course. But whereas in Eastern Europe, for example, the leadership that brought down those regimes, Solidarity, Charter 77, had the training and were ready and the will to build democracies in those countries. Nothing of that kind existed in Iraq, and so we have the present sad scene we see. I do think that they are better off, honestly. There can be actions that are mistaken from an overall point of view. Consider, for instance, British imperialism back in the 19th century. One of its causes was ending slavery coming from Africa, and actually they did quite a bit in that way. And yet British imperialism of that time was overall a disastrous mistake for Western civilization, not to speak of for the peoples who were colonized and taken over.
This question for Chris Tunsing, borrowing again from Christopher Hitchens, who made this point in Slate. I hope I'm not taking all your questions away, Christopher.
Perfectly okay.
I doubt it.
Hardly.
And this is a follow-on to where you ended your remarks about the problem of real democracy in Iraq. The question was, what if 1/10 of the energy of the anti-war movement was now devoted to helping the secular and democratic forces in Iraq and Kurdistan, to giving assistance to a free press, to helping to sponsor political prisoners and searches for the missing, providing money and materials for human rights and women's groups? Is any of this happening? Is there any sign of a solidarity movement from within the people who oppose the war but who profess real concern for the chances of democracy and some kind of real civil society in Iraq? Or has everyone taken a hands-off, it's not my problem attitude?
That's a very good question. And I think that I would agree with Christopher Hitchens in some small measure that the anti-war movement does have some things to answer for in precisely that regard. One of the characteristics of the anti-war movement, and in fact the movement to end the economic sanctions on Iraq that existed in this country and internationally, one of its main weaknesses was precisely that it did not have much Iraqi participation. And there were a few reasons for that. One was that there was a very vocal radical left of that movement, which had a hands-off Iraq attitude, which was a total non-starter with most Iraqis, especially Iraqis inside the country, who were experiencing the brutality of Saddam Hussein's regime on a daily basis. There was another sector of that movement that primarily formulated a humanitarian and moral critique of economic sanctions, a very deserved critique of the sanctions in the 1990s, but chose to sidestep the question of the responsibility of the Iraqi regime for keeping the sanctions in place. The sanctions, like the war, have to be laid at the doorstep of not only the United States and the United Nations, but also Saddam Hussein's regime. There was always a symbiotic relationship there. There was a small section of the anti-sanctions movement and the anti-war movement, which, if I may make a gross generalization, was the right wing of that movement, which based its ideas primarily in discourses of human rights, arms control, concepts like this. And they were often alienated from the movement precisely because many people in the movement did not want to engage the question of the brutality of Saddam Hussein's regime and its responsibility for the succession of Iraq crises over the 1990s and into the present day. Sadly, I would say that so far that tendency is continuing in the occupation era. And by that I mean that this tripartite division of the movement has basically reproduced itself. And there are some people who say that the rallying cry of the movement should be U.S. out of Iraq, even though many, probably most leaders, Iraqi intellectuals in exile and in the country, think that an immediate U.S. withdrawal would be disastrous for the country, just simply in terms of basic security. And so there isn't this this organic linkage between the movement and Iraqis, either in exile or in the country, and that has been a major weakness of the anti-war movement. That does not, however, detract from the validity of the moral critique that the movement advanced, both against the sanctions and against the war.
Okay. Okay, the last question is for Christopher Hitchens. And I'm torn between which question I want to ask him. You write in one of the essays that we included in the Iraq War Reader, in the more recent one, that the United States is now at war with the forces of reaction, and nobody's entitled to view this battle as a spectator. So my question for you is, how many innocent civilians are you willing to kill in order to win this war? For example, would you support a preemptive attack on North Korea, possibly using so-called mini-nukes, if that was deemed necessary to get rid of its nuclear program, even if you knew that the resultant radioactive fallout would poison tens of thousands of innocent people?
Well, preemptive is now almost the only word that unfailingly gives me an erection.
Glad we can help.
Preventive used to do it, but it doesn't cut it now. It has to be preemptive and preventive. I think I perhaps ought to begin by saying what I mean by being at war with the forces of reaction. I'm not going to avoid your prisoner's dilemma, of course, but I'll just clarify a bit. It struck me as very remarkable after the 11th of September that the United States instantly found that it had to quarrel with people it thought had up till then been its allies. In other words, the the national security state systems of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia were the ones who had actually incubated and disseminated the ideas of and practices of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So people who'd been thought of as friendly regimes suddenly became very questionable. And I thought that was one of the great missed opportunities of the left in that moment, was to say, well, here we really have found out how lousy our foreign policy alignments are, instead of which the left thought, surely there must be a way in which it's all America's fault, and we brought this on ourselves. And a huge opportunity was missed to mount a critique of the client state. But if you look at the extension of this argument into the confrontation with Saddam, you'll see that the United States was willing to quarrel with Turkey over Kurdistan. It's never had a public quarrel with the Turkish military on this question before. To obviously help convince the Turks that it was high time they made concessions on Cyprus, to say to the Saudis, if you don't want us to use the base that we built for you, we won't. We'll go to Qatar instead. Qatar is also a Wahhabi Muslim state, kingdom, but it lets women vote and run for office and drive, and it's abolished censorship, and it's hosted Al Jazeera. In other words, all across the region, even though many of these democratic evolutions are fairly millimetrical in the Gulf and elsewhere, potentially they're much larger, I think, in Iran, you tend to find these days that partly for reasons of self-interest and partly survival, and partly perhaps learning from some of the critique that some of us have been leveling against this policy for many years, the United States finds itself more and more on the right side of things. Its policy is roughly what you'd hope. The administration, for example, took quite a forward position on the arbitrary imprisonment of Professor Ibrahim. They didn't used to be like this. So I think this is a moment well worth, as it were, capturing, refining, and demanding that there be more of, instead of this endless negativity, abstentionism, and cynicism. Now, where are the cases that won't yield to this? Well, Iraq was one, in my opinion, and North Korea is another. I don't believe, for obvious reasons, that Iran belongs in the Axis. A state, I think, has to meet three, probably, qualifications. One, that it violates the Genocide Convention in respect of its own population, or mounts some equivalent atrocity against them. Second, that in respect of its neighboring countries, it violates the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions and all laws governing war crimes and human rights. That would also apply very heavily to Saddam Hussein. Third, that it sponsors or helps international gangsterism, which is Baghdad has been a safe house for international gangsterism and terrorism for many years. I myself interviewed Abu Nidal in Baghdad some time ago. It wasn't very hard to do. You didn't have to make a secret appointment. He was in the phone book. He had a villa. His gang was an arm of the Ba'ath Party in its foreign policy. And then, well, we should add, of course, the fourth, which is the latent or blatant attitude to the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction. Now, Iraq met all those conditions, and so does, or North Korea would like to do the same. The short answer to your question is I would not forswear any method of warfare in advance. I wouldn't. I want them not to think that there's anything I wouldn't do. And I have to say, Jonathan, that what you said was really startling to me. If I understood you correctly, and I made a note of your remarks, you said...
I think we're moving into this section.
This is the North Korea question.
Yes, good.
It's a North Korea question.
It's a perfect segue, which is, go ahead, ask him his question. Go.
I can do it quickly. If I understood Jonathan correctly, and I hope I did not, he said that North Korea was driven to get nasty and acquire nuclear weapons because George Bush had been unkind to it and hurt its feelings. This is an absolute surrender and a complete negation of the truth. Well, I don't know. Do we have a transcript of this? Can we get one? I understood him to say that North Korea had been pushed into the nuclear corner by the United States policy. All the time that Kim Jae-jung was struggling to democratize South Korea, making every kind of opening he could to the North, sending food aid, helping to persuade the United States to build reactors to feed, rather provide power to North Korea's famished and starved and unbelievably tyrannized people. All this time, Kim Jong-il was manufacturing a production line for plutonium weapons and simply laughing and sneering at any attempt to save his people from his unbelievable cruelty. Now, I don't want a regime like that to be in any doubt that it would cease to exist if it pushed this to a confrontation. Not just the government, but the state would cease to exist. North Korea would be no more as a state. Not as a people, we hope, but we would not in advance disarm ourselves of any option. I think it's very important that they understand that.
Well, I apologize for interrupting, but I thought that this would be a perfect segue into the next section of our discussion, which is we were going to let each of our panelists sort of have one free question of another panelist. So do you want to make that your question to Jonathan, or would you like to reserve that?
No, that was an observation.
Okay.
That means Jonathan doesn't have a chance to answer. However,
It was the germ of a critique. These regimes are not nasty because we're mean to them. That's a stupid, masochistic viewpoint.
Would you like the chance to make an observation in response to that?
Yes. Well, in the first place, it was not actually the plutonium program, but the uranium program, which was stepped up, the one you're referring to, I think, because, and that's an important difference. Certainly, North Korea has had a nuclear program, actually, since about 1985, and it's been a sort of stop-and-start business from that period on. In the late 1990s, well, it had the plutonium program, depending on the reactors that were brought over from Russia, has been the one that has been the subject of negotiation. Meanwhile, you're quite right, except that it's plutonium, except that it's uranium, that the North Koreans got into that business before George Bush came into power. But in this nuclear business, these degrees and each step in the process is critically important. Let's take India, for example. In 1974, they set off what was called a peaceful nuclear weapon. And yet it wasn't until 1998 that they actually set off 5 more tests and declared themselves to be a nuclear power and in the nuclear business as a nuclear power. That was a critically important shift, and you can see that by the fact that Pakistan felt it needed to respond by formally getting it for the first time into the nuclear business. So also with North Korea. When President Bush announced the axis of evil policy, in effect threatening them with regime change if they got nuclear weapons, they radically escalated their nuclear program, both verbally and in actual fact, by withdrawing also the plutonium program from the negotiations and from the limitations that had been on it up to that point. And that's far more serious, by the way, because that can give them an ongoing ability to create 6 or 7 nuclear weapons every year. So this was a very radical shift, not only technically, but also politically and geopolitically, and it was one that was directly triggered by the Bush threat, as they said, and it's simply true. And not only that, but as I suggested before, this change is actually one that makes perfect sense in a kind of cold-blooded way, at least according to the logic of nuclear strategy as it's been propounded by simply every nuclear power, which is that, if, as I said before, if you want to make yourself safe in a nuclear-armed world, and if somebody's threatening you with regime change or blowing you off the face of the earth, you better go and get nuclear weapons. And in actual fact, I hope you're not applauding because somebody got nuclear weapons. I think that's a disaster.
They're all going to rush out and get them.
So I think the evidence is very clear that the Bush administration did provoke the Koreans into a very sharp and radical escalation of their nuclear policy and technology.
Does one of the panelists want to ask another panelist a question? If not, we'll turn to our students, who I know have a lot of questions. Okay.
I think we should.
Yep.
Chris has it.
My question is for Christopher Hitchens. I'd like to know if you agree with Professor Ibrahim on the question of Islamist participation in democratic elections, free and fair democratic elections in the Arab and Islamic world.
I think you'll have to...
Given your well-known antipathy, your devout secularism, which I share, by the way, and your well-known antipathy to Islamism in general, and your comments about it today, I wonder if you concur with Dr. Ibrahim's assessment that the best way for democracy to flower of its own accord in the Middle East is for Islamists to be given the right to participate in free and fair elections without government interference, and without this bromide that we hear from the regimes of the region that they cannot open up because otherwise Islamists will storm the palace gates. Or do you agree with Donald Rumsfeld when he says that if the one eventuality the U.S. will not countenance is for Iraq to become, in some measure, an Islamic state?
Well, there are two elements to your question. One is the participation of Islamists in politics, and the other is the attempt by some Islamic forces to impose a theocracy which would mean there wouldn't be any politics for anyone to participate in. And I think that that's a line that, for example, is fairly, I haven't been in Egypt for a number of years, but my impression from Egyptians I know and from studies I've read is that Dr. Ibrahim is approximately correct. The Islamic theocrats, the violent Islamic jihad forces, isolated themselves partly by the murder of foreign visitors to Luxor and by many other atrocities. Their appeal to the population is very limited. The Islamic Muslim Brotherhood type parties probably would get between 20 and 25% in an election, but wouldn't be able to form a government. Suppose they did, I think it would probably be a very good thing, as it is in Turkey, because it means they have to take responsibility and they have to subject themselves to another vote further down the road. And I think that enormously spreads the base on which democracy is conducted. And I would add, as a secularist, that anyone who tries to run a modern or even semi-modern society out of the teachings of the Holy Book will find that they can't do it. They'll be discredited. It doesn't need to be proved again. They can try and prove it if they like. It's taken 25 years in Iran to run itself into the sand, but it would happen. And I would be there to jeer and say that I told them so, as I would if people tried to run the United States by the Ten Commandments or reinstate school prayer. But let them, by all means, try and let them profit from the experience. What cannot be tolerated, however, is that when that failure comes, that it is blamed on a Jewish conspiracy in America that is behind all the woes of this failed state, and that thus it's legitimate to export violence to non-Islamic societies. If there's any sign of it taking that course, then I think they should be reminded of what happened to the Taliban.
Yes, may I? I'd like to ask Professor Ibrahim a question, if I may. He suggested, and I warmly agree, that an imperial policy of any kind, even a benign one, will not be helpful in bringing democracy in the Islamic world. I wondered if he could tell us what policy of the United States would be helpful in advancing this end.
Well, I heard one of the comments. By the way, this has been, can you hear me? By the way, I enjoyed this very elegant debate. This is fantastic. But somewhere along the line, someone suggested that the peace movement, the anti-war movement here in the United States, could do something more constructive to help civil society in our part of the world. And this is really where I would start. I would say, given the dynamism and the enthusiasm of the anti-war forces, of the peace forces that we have seen in so many ways in great American cities, reminded me of the 60s when I was here as a student. Well, this force, this energy, should direct some of its creative power to helping forces of civil society in our part of the world. That is one will clear the collective mind of Arabs and Muslims from the fact that you guys hate us. You kept asking, why does the world or why do the Muslims hate you? They asked the question differently there. Why do the Americans hate us? Well, having lived in both societies, I don't think the Arabs really hate Americans or the Muslims hate Americans. Nor do I think there is a visceral hate among Americans toward my people. I think there is a good deal of things to do on both sides to establish a more constructive engagement, a more constructive dialogue. And in this respect, you can help us a lot. Civil society in our part of the world is still weak, surrounded, under siege by authoritarian regimes. You can break into that siege. You can reach out to us. You can teach us a lot. We can learn a lot from you, not as a government, but as a people. And I think that is the key to the American genius, is that people can do things for themselves. They don't wait for governments to do it. And that's what we're trying to do. So that's where I will start. Second, I will hold Rumsfeld and George W. Bush and Paul Wolfowitz and everybody who is viewed by my friends here in the United States as a conservative. By the way, everybody among my friends warned me against seeing these guys in Washington. However, I went ahead and I saw all of them. Anyone who wanted to see me, I saw him. And I must say, I did that despite the advice of many of my Democrat, New Left friends from the days when I was here as a student activist. Because I learned something in my years of activism back home. It's not to label people beforehand. Engage them, see what they have to say, debate with them, agree, disagree, but engage them. And that is what I'm calling for a transatlantic, a trans-Mediterranean engagement between our people and you, America, Europe. And so long as we at least know that there are agreed upon very broad goals, we will leave the details to a historical process. We don't have to have blueprints for everything we do. Let us just get in the right direction. I think we all agree that oppression, repression, dictatorship is something of the past. It should be removed from everywhere we can remove it from. We agree that peace and democracy are two sides of the same thing. By the way, one reason why the peace process has had ups and downs in the Middle East is because of lack of democracy. Had we had democratic governments, I think we could have reached a peace agreement 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But the fact that we don't have democratic governments has made every dictator hang on to the Arab-Israeli conflict as his own raison d'etre for staying in power. And therefore, I think peace or democracy is a prerequisite for peace. That is what I wrote in the Washington Post some 2 or 3 weeks ago. And therefore, let us have alliance between civil society on both sides of the Atlantic, civil society on both sides of the Mediterranean. Thank you.
Christopher, Professor Ibrahimi, if either of you want to ask a question, otherwise we will turn it to the students too.
I think we should.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Chris Malone.
Another Chris.
Hello, my name is Siobhan Downs, and I'm a student from West Virginia University. And I would first like to... Hello, is that loud enough? Hi, my name is Siobhan Downs, and I'm a student from West Virginia University, and I would like to thank our distinguished panel for their insights in these trying times. Thank you very much. My question is directed to the entire panel. Initially, what actions should be taken in Iraq to engage and to help build a trusting and politically involved civil society, which many people believe is the first necessary step to begin the process of democratization in Iraq?
Excellent question.
Who wants to try that first?
Doctor?
Do you want me to try?
Would you like to?
Go ahead. You haven't spoken for a while. I like to listen to you.
Okay. Christopher?
Well, the problem is that there are so many things that need to be done at the same time. I mean, quite evidently, it seems to me anyway, self-evident, that somebody should be fired in Washington because... Oh, it was for me. Okay, thanks. I thought it was whoever it was. Someone beautiful must have appeared behind me. Because it's not as if they didn't know that there would be a great deal of repair and care work to be done once the military half of the operation was over. It was perfectly well understood. It seems to me outrageous that once Baghdad airport was open for traffic again, they weren't landing a C-130 every hour and just having time to turn it round before landing another one, as with the Berlin airlift, full of the needful supplies and also of the Guardian's needed to ensure their equitable distribution. I hope there's a high-level inquiry to find out exactly how many people need to be impeached for not doing that. And second, it seems to me if you make a promise in advance to the Iraqi people that the civilian authority, however interim or provisional it may be, will, because after all we know that the preponderance of power will be in the hand of the occupier for what we hope is a limited period of time. If you make a promise that that interim regime is composed of faces and names that are by, for and of the Iraqi people, then it's not a promise you can go back on. It simply, it can't be fooled with. So on these two points, I think the process has been very, very badly begun indeed, and I think risks jeopardizing the whole point of the regime change strategy in the beginning. The hope has to be, though, I think, look, there are 4.5 million Iraqis out of a probable 23 to 24, 4.5 million of them forced to live overseas. I haven't met all of them, of course. I've met a good number of them. Most of them have at least 4 PhDs and speak about 5 languages. They're full of extraordinary skills and talents that enough confidence is created. I think this is very important in all these societies. It's true in Iran as well, crucially, and in Lebanon, and in Palestine, to bring the diaspora home, to encourage the right of return, because that in itself would form an important part of the bridge of Atlantic and Mediterranean that Professor Ibrahim just spoke so eloquently about. That would be a physical proof of not a clash of civilization, but a fusion of skills and civil society activism, and that's where I would suggest we bend our efforts.
I'd just like to ask Chris Tensing if he has anything to add or suggest in an answer to that question, too.
Yes, I think several people in Washington should be impeached immediately post-haste. It's true, as Christopher Hitchens said, that virtually everything that has happened after the war was widely predicted by independent experts outside of government who knew Iraq. And it was only the media cheerleaders for the war who told us that it would be ad Ahmed Chalabi and stir democracy, as I pointed out. The first thing that needs to be done is that the U.S. has to stop meddling in what otherwise could be an indigenous process for getting together a representative arrangement for a future governance of Iraq. Unfortunately, there is still a factional approach which is prevalent both in Iraqi politics and in Washington politics, where some elements of the U.S. government have their favorite factions within the formerly exiled Iraqi opposition now in Baghdad, who they would like to promote. And this is behind a lot of the missteps and Keystone Cops appearance of Jay Garner's fortunately brief tenure as American Viceroy. And it's behind some of the continuing confusion with Paul Bremer's approach to administration of Iraq. So the first thing that has to happen is that the U.S. has to at least admit that the UN can do this better than the United States. And they should stop meddling in the work of the UN Special Representative, who will shortly be working in Baghdad to work on these post-war governance issues.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Kim Masivas, and I'm a recent graduate of Pace University. My question is for the entire panel, and it kind of deals with something that no one's touched on yet, so I thought I would throw it out there for you guys. Can anyone or would anyone comment on the usage of depleted uranium in both Gulf wars as it affects our military and their offspring, as well as the Iraqi civilians and their offspring? And to that extent, how does the DoD or the administration justify the usage of it? And why isn't this more of an issue in the American media, as it affects us greatly? Thank you.
There's a serious ongoing scientific controversy about the level of danger that is posed by depleted uranium, which is the cast-off material from the nuclear weapon program and is used because of its great weight in shells for piercing tanks and other armored vehicles. All I can say about that is that when American forces are sent into zones where that is heavy and where it's been recorded, they were required to wear special suits and so forth. The same for European forces. Now that suggests to me that whatever the state of the scientific evidence and however that will eventually be resolved, that there's enough reason to fear that stuff that it's simply unconscionable to be using it in war on civilian populations. I would add one thing to that that's very disturbing, and that is you may have noticed that the Bush administration has just repealed a ban on making small nuclear weapons. The reason for that ban was to keep a sharp, clear threshold between conventional and nuclear war. Now, depleted uranium doesn't cross that threshold in any formal way. Nevertheless, in a certain sense, because it is a product of the nuclear industry, and it can only exist where there is such an industry, it's one more small signal that the United States is ready to profit from its weapon of mass destruction program, even as it seeks to ban other countries around the world from getting into that business, and I think it's an untenable position.
I'd like to say something about that.
Mr. Rick?
In an earlier book of Jonathan's, The Fate of the Earth, he makes the unforgettable, very incisive point about nuclear weaponry, that we don't have another world where we can test this stuff. So we better act prudently and act as if this was the only globe on which we could conduct the experiment. In other words, one of the objections to totalitarianism to begin with is that it treats people as if they were subjects in a great experiment, or a grand experiment, and that's, when extended to nuclear matters, just as sinister. And in a still earlier book of his about Vietnam, he was one of the many people to point out to readers like myself that there was something horrific about the war, based on the nature of, you could intuit the horrific nature of the Vietnam War from the weaponry used, from the lazy dog missile, for example, the fragmentation bomb, from napalm, from phosphorus, from certain kinds of tactics and weapons. You could intuit the ghastly colonial and racist character of the war. Now, I think what he said about depleted uranium must be true. In other words, we should act as if it might be as bad as we think it is until we know better. But I think it deserves to be said that for the first time in history now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff can report to the President and say, Mr. President, if you wish to give us an order to remove the despotic regime of a country, it might be Afghanistan, it might be Serbia, it might be Iraq, without doing really very much damage at all to its population or its infrastructure, we believe we can obey that order. We can carry that out with what are rather euphemistically called PGM, or precision-guided munitions. The way in which that was done in those three cases seems to me to have absolutely altered the whole nature of warfare and politics, and is an achievement which needs to be refined along with the weapons, but which obviously is undergoing a steady process of refinement. Far less damage was done to Iraq this time than in the last intervention over Kuwait, and far more discriminating weapons were used. So this, I think, it means that a whole qualitative change has come over, among other things, what we mean when we talk about by empire.
Can I add I have to contest that last assertion. First of all, the question is how many innocent Iraqi civilians are too many? I think that as we learn more about what actually happened during the course of the war, we're going to find that the low body count which we think exists is going to rise. We're going to find that it will continue after the war because of the use of cluster munitions, artillery-borne cluster munitions, particularly in the south-central areas of Iraq around Hilla and Nasiriyah and so on. Kids are going to be losing limbs and dying from those munitions for perhaps some time to come. We have not seen the Pentagon mount a comprehensive effort to remove those munitions from those areas. When one of Mr. Hitchens' bête noirs, American peace activists in Baghdad during the war, went to CENTCOM immediately after the war and when the events in Hilla were just becoming known, and asked the military officers what they were going to do about this cluster munitions problem. The response was that they had never heard of this place Hilla, and they thought it was a suburb of Baghdad instead of its own town. There is a study that I would direct everyone to, done by the Project of Defense Alternatives. It's online. It's a nonprofit based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And what they have found is that contrary to administration propaganda, in relative terms, more civilians, innocent people died in the bombing of Afghanistan than died in the Kosovo campaign. And we may find that proportionate to the size of the populations. So let's not be too quick to judge the success of our precision-guided munitions.
There's time for one or two more questions from students, and then we'll turn it over to the audience questions.
Hi, my name is Hila Stern, and I'm from Israel, Tel Aviv University, and I would like to focus my question on Israel. There is a lot of talking going on about a new window of opportunity in the Middle East, and like specifically in Israel now, peace process going on. And I would like to know how everything that happened in Iraq and in the region would influence Israel. And I'm not talking about only the Israeli-Palestinians' point of view, but I'm talking like in other countries, such as Syria and Lebanon, where the regimes haven't changed. This is part of it. And the other part is, I would like to know if, do you think the United States will give an important part for European countries to take part in this process going on, if there is one going on? Thank you.
You want to try that? Who wants to take that?
Well, I'd like to say just one thing about it. Until 1947-48, there were more Jews living in Baghdad than there were in Jerusalem. And most of them, as a consequence of the partition of Palestine, were flung out, so to speak, reciprocally by Arab nationalist regimes in revenge for the maltreatment of the Palestinians. It seems to me one possibly very good outcome of the regime change in the region would be the right of Iraqi Jews to return to Baghdad if they wish, which I think would be an excellent example for the region in general and for the culture of internationalism that one hopes to instate there. And that, by the way, that would remove that right of return, one of the many excuses that Israel used to give for not compensating or admitting to the right of return or compensation for Palestinian refugees. They used to say, we can't address this question while Jewish people are being thrown out of Iraq and Morocco. So, in other words, two injustices held each other hostage. I think it's possible really now to think beyond that kind of crude ethnicity and nationalism and say, well, it might well be that many diasporas will see their old homes again and be able to reclaim them if they wish. Very good. Not before time.
It's a huge question. Let me say that I think that the roadmap initiative of the so-called quartet of the U.S., Russia, the UN, and the European Union does have some modest, promising aspects to it. One of them is that it internationalizes the presumed solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is a step in the right direction. The United States should not have a monopoly on Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy. We have seen that the effects of that have been quite detrimental to achieving peace. The other positive thing about the roadmap is that it states explicitly that its end goal is the establishment of a Palestinian state. And if those two things, the internationalization of the peace process and this timeline that leads to a Palestinian state, are held to by the actor which has the weight to push this process forward, and that is the United States, then that will be a good thing. However, there are deep flaws in the document which make optimism hard to sustain with regard to the roadmap. And the primary one is one that's rarely discussed in our media, and that is simply the facts on the ground, particularly in the West Bank. And one fact on the ground, which is hardly ever mentioned, is that Israel is in the process of constructing what it calls a security fence, what Palestinians call an apartheid wall, which in many places encroaches considerably into the territory of the West Bank that would be part of the presumptive Palestinian state that is envisioned by the roadmap. The roadmap does not even mention this attempt by the right wing of the Israeli political spectrum to advance its territorial expansionism at the expense of peace. So the United States needs first of all, it needs to give up its monopoly on the peace process. One would hope that at future peace summits, not just the President of the United States would be at the table, but also other actors to even the playing field a little bit. And also have to stop obsessing on these so-called illegal settlement outposts built since March 2001 and focus on the rest of the facts on the ground that are potentially going to make a Palestinian state not viable in the future if it is established.
Hi, my name is Leland Graham from Winthrop University, and this question is directed towards Mr. Schell. You cited as an argument against U.S. intervention in Iraq today the U.S. support of Iraq in the 1980s. I think that's a great rhetorical point, but I question its logic. Should past bad behavior really dictate against current good behavior? Because we failed in the past, should we be crippled now, or should we rather learn from our mistakes and act positively?
Well said.
Well, that's a great question. And certainly I certainly would not oppose any real attempt to learn from past mistakes and to do a better job in the present. But I honestly have to say that I don't think that that is the case here. I have certainly seen no statement whatsoever from the current administration expressing any regret for the United States' support of Saddam Hussein in that period. They simply want that to go down the memory hole, as far as I can tell. So it would appear then that it's not a real change of heart leading to a wiser and better policy, but rather citing something in the past that is no longer current as a justification that is not sincerely meant for a policy that we need to advance for other reasons. I need to apologize, by the way, to further questioners, because in a few moments I'm going to have to leave the panel to get to some other folks who are waiting for me. I want to apologize. That's what will be happening in a few minutes. Yeah.
Would you accept a small correction before you go, Jonathan?
Yeah.
It seems to me...
Maybe.
Well, it seems to me that in the writing of William Crystal, who can't be here to say it for himself, and Lawrence Kaplan and Paul Wolfowitz and many of the other proponents, the strong proponents of regime change in Washington, and some of them within the administration, many of them on its periphery, there's a very direct acceptance of responsibility for past American crimes and missteps in Iraq, and a very strong critique of the objective collusion between the Reagan administration and Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, the manipulation of the Kurdish question by Henry Kissinger, and the capitulation to Saudi pressure to keep Saddam Hussein in power, reconfirm him in power in 1991. My impression is that that's a responsibility that's been fairly well shouldered. I wish that the Jimmy Carter fans would accept their responsibility for what he did. It's helping to start incite Saddam against Iran.
Well, I think it's true that that William Crystal has done that, and some of the others on the sidelines of the administration. But I haven't seen a single word in an official capacity from anyone in the administration, and that seems to me to speak very loudly.
I think you'd find that was true. Well, you would find that Paul Wolfowitz had written that, I'm sure.
And there are plenty of others on the sidelines of the Iraq debate. There are plenty of others on the sidelines of the Iraq debate who, at the time, in the 1980s, were on record saying that the United States should tilt toward Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War, as the official State Department policy was known at the time. And they have simply switched their position when the winds started blowing the other way. So there's plenty of accusations of hypocrisy to throw around here.
Okay. We're almost out of time, and I know, Jonathan, are you? Yes, you are taking off. Okay.
Jonathan, thank you so much for being part of this. So that leads us to our second question. The first question involved puppets and puppet government and working on Sesame Street. When I'm not doing this, I'm very sorry. We won't have a chance to ask it now. But I would like to ask Christopher a question from the audience. What about imperial overstretch is the question, something that Kevin Phillips wrote about in the Iraq War Reader. With a sluggish economy, rising unemployment, record deficits, a balance of payments problem, and a record high national debt, can America afford the policy that you're recommending? And that also seems to me to kind of segue into the third point that you never got to finish, which another member of the audience would love you to finish. So that's our question.
Well, that's very generous and leaves me enormous amount of room. I'll try and be as specific as I can. The person who really coins the idea of imperial overstretch is Professor Paul Kennedy in The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which was a considerable succès d'estime in the Academy and beyond a few years ago. I don't know how many people have read Professor Kennedy's recent recantation on this point, but it's worth looking up. I'm sure you can find it on the web. He revisited his book and decided that he was completely wrong in predicting that the United States would overburden itself with military expenditure. He spent some time analyzing the enormous, the unbelievable, overwhelming firepower and reach of just one single US carrier group. I think there are now 15 of those and scheduled to be more, and said that the extraordinary thing is this confers a military superiority and a global reach undreamable of even by the British Navy, let alone by Rome, and that it's done on almost minuscule, almost millimetrical percentage of the gross national product, and may even have a good multiplier effect, sometimes called military Keynesianism, on the economy, on technology, and on employment. It's absolutely extraordinary. It doesn't seem to cost anything at all, and it may even pay for itself. Obviously, if the United States had to, if there was a serious civil war, for example, between Sharia-type fanatics, keep your nerve, comrades, Sharia-type fanatics and others in a country, say, the size of Indonesia, I mean, the task of arbitrating that would be extraordinary, and obviously the United States couldn't take it all on. But in most of these cases, there is a regional balance of power to be sought. For example, I wanted to say this to Jonathan too, but there wasn't time. The idiocy of North Korea's rash and insane nuclear policy is that it is almost certain to force Japan to reconsider its non-nuclear constitution. The Japanese are not going to live for very long with the idea of an nuclear-armed North Korea. And that's why it's simply not true to say that North Korea does this because Bush hurt its feelings. It's a fatuous thing to say. China has every interest in not having a nuclear-armed Japan. Thus, China has and is exerting tremendous influence on North Korea not to take this insane course of action. We are not alone, in other words, in this. An intelligent diplomacy can find friends just as much as it can isolate allies. And I think that's probably the future. But it's good to know that in back of this are about 15 carrier groups, in case anyone really gets nasty. And that they're manned by volunteers, and men and women of all ethnicities and every known gender. And
Christopher, if I can interject, though, not having read Paul Kennedy's analysis, I am surprised to hear you say that this seems to be something that our country can afford ad infinitum, as it were, when the people in this city are seeing the class sizes of the schools that their kids go to increase, and firehouses closed, and we're not even we don't even have enough money to spend on the new Homeland Security measures that everyone seems to think that we need.
I don't think that money is going to build dreadnoughts, Mika.
Mm-hmm.
That's not dread. They don't sort of go around thinking, how can we squeeze the school lunch budget and build another cruise missile? That's not how the economy works. Oh, that's what you think. Oh, and wait, and let's just see, and prescription drugs for seniors, I guess you're very high on that. And the election was stolen by, I know, okay, I know.
I guess I was speaking.
And there's nothing to choose between Bush and Bin Laden. I know. I know how you feel. I'm so through with it, I can't tell you.
You feel their pain. You feel their pain.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I was asking a serious question.
I relish their pain.
I was trying to ask a serious question, which was, can we afford this policy at what cost to our own society? And I was not asking you to disagree with the goal, as you are expressing it at least, but I'm sorry that I didn't seem to get a serious answer.
Oh, well, I can't leave it like that. And I don't want to, look, I dislike putting myself in the position of arguing from authority. I think I will just say that if you examine Professor Kennedy's carefully reasoned evidence and examine his logic in climbing down from his position that imperial overstretch would beggar the US economy, then you might be more enlightened than by my callousness and frivolity. My want of compassion.
Well, I'm afraid, folks, that we are just about out of time. and we've lost half of our panel, unfortunately. But I'm going to ask Professor Greg Julian to come up to close our proceedings. We will hang around, and there'll be a chance to keep talking for quite a while. So I'm sorry we can get to more of the questions.
And we have a reception outside as well, where there'll be books available by us and by Christopher Hitchens and by Chris Tensing's magazine.
You can't talk to me without a receipt from now on.
That's exactly right.
The pro bono bit is over.
And we believe C-SPAN is a nonprofit organization. Anytime we talk about 9/11, Iraq, democracy, and empire, 9/11 for many of us was a light that ignited and reignited our quest for democracy. And I think what the authors have done during this discussion has reminded us of the continuum upon which democracy rests. From the very substantive need to construct basic democratic forms in Iraq to the more liberal state policies that we think we're capable of engendering in America, to what Jonathan Schell was really talking about, which I would think would be the transformative notions of politics, where we're talking about a culture of peace and globalization with equity and some more equitable distribution between North and South. Aspirations, to be sure. But when we looked at power, and when the panel looked at power, it used to be enough to criticize America to be hegemonic. Well, when we talk about empire, we've really employed the use of force, and we've relegated the idea of power as being influence and using our authority and using our exemplary power as possibilities. So what I think we have here is a continual crisis of trying to, on one hand, be transformative in our democratic thought, while in the political realm move an inch closer to being satisfied that force can replace hegemony and authority in the more salutary ways of thinking about power. I think what we are leaving here with is clearly a dilemma of 9/11. Do we take this as a new form of non-state actors operating in our realm and therefore give us the license to go out and attack state actors that harbor terrorists? One must think, however, of Saudi Arabia and why we're using that as a pumping station. The other thing is that this will continue, hopefully, for the next hour and a half in a much more intimate setting. The McKellian Institute for Public Policy and Management is holding a reception for everybody in this audience, and we really want you to come there, enjoy our hospitality of Pace University, and moreover, give these authors an opportunity to continue their wonderful dialogue and crisp debate. We're thrilled that you're here. Thank you for coming, and again, thank you for all those people who participated.
This belongs
to the region. Less one dictator, I am happier. And I will be happier when all the dictators in the Middle East disappear. I and other like-minded, are fighting for that. We have no illusion about how long it will take. We have no illusions about the kind of democracy we'll have. It will not be a Westminster democracy. It will not be a congressional democracy. It will be a little bit messy. It will be difficult. It will be agonizing. But it will be far better than we have had for the last 50 years. And on that score, an activist does not look at all the negative factors that work against democracy. I work as those positive factors that can help democracy. And I am determined, with others, to make those factors, even if they represent 20, 30, 40% success elements, we are determined to make them a majority. We are determined to make them prevail and to bring about democracy. My third point has to do with the peace in the region. I'm gratified that there is a summit meeting today in Sharm el-Sheikh, in my country, that President Bush has finally decided to get involved and to work for peace. I hope it will work. I will work with other minded peace activists in the region to make it work, and it is up to you to help us in this drive. I think peace and democracy are twin objectives without which this region will continue to take the world to the brink of war every 7 years. I calculated from 1945 to 2003, how many times has this region been a theater for armed conflict? 10 times in less than 50 years. 10 times. Starting with the Marine landing in Lebanon back in 1958. This is the involvement of the United States alone. And if you want to avoid another war, if you want to avoid another bin Laden, if you want to avoid another Saddam Hussein, then you have to work for peace and democracy in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ibrahim. It's really inspiring to have you here and to hear you speak. And we have a wonderful second speaker that we would like to introduce now, Jonathan Schell, whom I'm sure most of you know as a Nation columnist for many years and author of important books, many that you know, the most recent of which is The Unconquerable World, Power, Violence, and the Will of the People. Jonathan was born here in New York and became known reporting on the Vietnam War for the New Yorker magazine. That's when I first heard of him. And he wrote a book, as you may know, called The Village of Ben Suk, which had an immense impression on me when I was starting out my career at Random House. Jonathan was the principal author of the Notes and Comment column in The New Yorker for many years. He writes for The Nation and for Harper's and Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic Monthly, you name it. He's taught at Emory, he's taught at Princeton and NYU and Wesley.
The ruling also sets forth some broad principles of law and cautioned the executive branch of government in Egypt to refrain from usurping excessive powers. Among the points made in the ruling are the rights of researchers to investigate and report on social problems in the country, the right of citizens to freedom of expression, and the right of lawful organizations to accept funding from non-Egyptian sources. It's really quite a privilege to have Dr. Ibrahim here with us, and I'm looking forward to what he has to say. I give you Dr. Saad Ibrahim.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and forgive me for not being able to stand up. The very broad title of this panel is very telling. I cannot address every item in the title. But I want to start from where this kind of introduction ended, my acquittal from charges in Egypt's highest court. That very episode tells us all about the drama that's going on in the Middle East right now. A fight between new forces that are trying to democratize the region, to establish equitable peace, and old forces, authoritarian, totalitarian forces that have ruled for so long and are determined to continue to rule. This fight, therefore, was not a personal fight. It really was a fight between these two set of forces in my region, not just in Egypt, but in the entire Middle East. Because there are other people in Syria, in Iraq, of course, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Palestine, who have gone through similar struggle to establish the rule of law, to establish democracy, to work for peace. The fact that I was sentenced to 7 years in jail, the fact that I fought back with my colleagues and finally got an acquittal, tells you exactly the size of the battle. It is not a hopeless battle. It is a battle that can be fought. It is a battle that can be won. And therefore, when we talk about the future of the Middle East, we have to keep that in mind. There are as many factors, as many elements that can push the region toward peace and democracy as there are that can set it back toward war, violence, terrorism, and oppression. My second remark has to do with Iraq itself, a country that I had the privilege of living in for a couple of years back in the 70s. A country with great assets, with great people, with great tradition, great civilization. However, it is one of those countries in the Middle East that has been bedeviled by one of the worst dictators in history, Saddam Hussein. I was against the war, but I was happy about the outcome of the war. This may not be a very popular position to take back home, but I took it. I said,
now to tell you how we're going to work this today.
Thanks, Chris. Let me start out by... Thank you. Let me start out by apologizing for those of you who originally heard about this event when it was first advertised. You may have heard that William Crystal, the editor of the Weekly Standard, was going to be one of our 4 panelists. And unfortunately, a few days ago, he had to pull out. He sends his apologies, but his new book was just translated into French, and so he's off to Paris, France, which we refer to as Paris Freedom, to do a book tour there. So, but his loss is our gain because we were very lucky. We were very lucky on such short notice to be able to get Saad Eddin Ibrahim to join our panel, and this is his first public appearance, if I understand correctly, since coming to the United States and needing to have some surgery. And we were very, very grateful that he was able to come. We're also very happy that we have such a diverse panel. It is our best effort to reflect the diversity of voices on this very difficult set of issues. 9/11, Iraq, empire, and democracy. Obviously, there are no black and whites in this discussion. And we are hoping here for a chance to have some civil debate and inquiry that will include you, the audience, as participants in asking questions towards the latter half of the program. We will invite you to put questions on index cards and hand them up, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible. We're also going to invite the students who are here for this week-long program to have a chance to ask a couple of questions. But first, we're going to hear from our 4 panelists. We've asked each of them to speak for a couple of minutes, and then Chris Cerf and I will hopefully ask some pointed questions, and they'll have a chance to ask each other a question. To give this discussion some focus, since 9/11, Iraq, empire, and democracy just about covers everything, we asked our panelists to focus on 2 specific things. One is the future of Iraq in the wake of the war, and the other is the future of America's role in the world, which obviously has taken some kind of a qualitative leap, or at least some people think it has. And so we're hoping that, yes, we will inevitably get into the debates of the last year, but that at least we will have a forward thrust. We are trying to look ahead. to the future. The order of the speakers was determined by picking cards from this deck. No, actually it wasn't. The order of the speakers are Saad Ibrahim, who will be followed by Jonathan Schell, then Chris Tunsing, and then batting cleanup Christopher Hitchens. So let me introduce our first speaker. Saad ad-Din Ibrahim is a professor of sociology at the American University in Cairo and the founder in 1988 of the Ibn Khaldun Center, which is a research and advocacy center focused on democratization and civil society. In the summer of 2000, he and 27 of his colleagues were arrested as they prepared to monitor the upcoming parliamentary elections in Egypt. All 28 were found guilty by a state security court and several were sent to jail. Dr. Ibrahim himself was sentenced to a 7-year term. He and his colleagues fought back in the courts, and their cases provoked worldwide condemnation. On March 18th of this year, I'm happy to say, Egypt's highest court acquitted him and 2 of his fellow defendants of all charges.
Christopher Cerf is an author, record and television producer, composer, lyricist, editor, and co-founder and president of the educational television production company Serious Thinking. Since its first season in 1970, Cerf has played a pivotal role in the creation and production of the Sesame Street television program, and most notably as a regular contributor of music and lyrics. In the process, he has won 2 Grammy Awards and 3 Emmy Awards for songwriting and music production. In 1970, he helped launch the most influential of recent humor magazines, The National Lampoon. The Iraq War Reader is Cerf's 3rd political anthology, his 2nd in collaboration with Mikael Sifry. Christopher Cerf, welcome. Mikael Sifry is senior analyst with Public Campaign, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C., working on comprehensive campaign finance reform. In that capacity, he has published articles and op-eds in the Washington Post, Newsday, The American Prospect, The Hill, Salon.com, intellectualpolitics.com, and many smaller papers and magazines. He is the co-author of Democracy That Works, a chapter in the Next Agenda, Blueprint for a New Progressive Movement, and is currently writing a book on how money and politics affects people in their everyday lives. His book, Spoiling for a Fight, Third-Party Politics in America, was described in Newsday as, quote, a commanding survey of contemporary third parties. In a more politically developed country, Sifry's reporting would be the gold standard of contemporary journalism, unquote. Prior to joining Public Campaign in 1997, Sifry was an editor and writer with The Nation magazine for 13 years, writing widely on domestic and international politics, especially the Middle East, his first love and specialty. He is also the founding member of the Independent Politics Group, which is affiliated with the Political Science Department of the City University of New York Graduate Center, and I'm honored to also be a founding member, and I'm also honored that he's here. I've had the opportunity to work with him for about 3 years on events like this. Please welcome Mikael Sifry.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thank you, President Caputo, and we're very, very grateful to PACE and to Simon & Schuster also, who made the Iraq War Reader possible. Basically, Mika and I have done this once before. We've done a book like this for the last Gulf War, and we had a real sense of deja vu this time, because it seemed that the same kind of problem existed as we saw it in what the public was seeing and hearing as we approached this war that happened the last time, which is basically we had a tremendous amount of coverage, 24-hour-a-day coverage on major television networks, etc. But a lot of that coverage was very much in the moment, and it seemed to us there was almost no discussion of the history of Iraq before all this happened. Even the last war wasn't mentioned that much. And also, basically, what led to the policies, what led to the U.S. And its relationship with Iraq, or the entire West's relationships with the Middle East. These things weren't being discovered in our kind of soundbite mentality. They weren't being discussed. So we felt if we could put into a book some of that background in a very readable way from people who were either experts on the subject or actually helped make the history themselves, or had very strong and informed opinions about it, we could perform a real service and also do something very interesting, which mattered to us because we had to spend the time. And we feel we've done that. And we were able, thanks to many of the people here, all of whom contributed, to really assemble some of the most wonderful writers and thinkers we know and knew of from every possible place on the political spectrum. We kind of look at it as a town meeting in print, and the only problem with doing a town meeting in print is you eventually have a deadline and they take your typewriters and computers away, and so you have to turn the book in. And we were sorry when that happened, but thanks to Pace College and Pace University and to others, we can keep that town meeting going with events like this. And so we're really glad we could be here, and I'm going to turn it over to Mika, and he's a Harold Willens Peace Fellow at the Nation Institute. He's currently living in New York, and we're honored to have him here today. Jonathan, you want to come up here?
I have to amend one thing that Chris said. The subtitle of my book is Power, Nonviolence, and the Will of the People.
That was a bad mistake.
It gives you a clue to what I will now be saying. I want to add that it's an honor to appear here today with Professor Ibrahim, who has lived what he believes, and it's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to say also that, as it happens, I live 6 blocks from here, also 6 blocks from where the World Trade Center once stood. And I guess it's impossible not to think of that on this day. In fact, it's impossible not to think of it on almost any day. I mention that not because I want to claim any special credential. I don't believe in such credentials. I think we all have a right and even an obligation to talk about things that we haven't personally experienced, but we did experience it here very close up in this community. I do mention it because what I want to go on to say is that I think that the United States in its foreign policy has headed off on a fairly drastically wrong track. And at the heart of the debate now unfolding on that policy, it seems to me, is the question of the role of force. Shall we rely chiefly on unilateral force to achieve our ends, or shall we proceed mainly cooperatively and peacefully together with our allies and the rest of the international community? And I think that this question resolves into 2 further questions. And first one is violence the best way to bring democracy to the world? And the second, is violence a suitable instrument for stopping the weapons of mass destruction? You'll recall that these were the 2 chief objectives that were set forth for the war. So let's look at the war so far. And by the way, I'm afraid to say I don't think it's over. In light of these questions, and then look at the deeper question of whether Iraq is going to be a good model for future operations as the administration proposes. The United States won militarily in Iraq, but at the same time lost the world. Both consequences, it seems to me, are harmful to the future of the United States. So first, democracy. The bestial dictatorship in Iraq has fallen, and no one who has watched the people clawing with their hands in mass graves to find some thigh bone or elbow of their relatives can be anything but glad of that. And yet the fact of the matter is that the current administration has never had, does not now have, and shows no signs of having in the future a policy of determining its military interventions on humanitarian grounds. If it did, we'd have 160,000 troops not in Iraq, but in the Congo, where 3 million people are estimated to have died as a result of the conflict there in recent years. But the question remains, nevertheless, whether the U.S. will now build democracy in Iraq and whether it will be able to do so. Not every liberation is at the same time a birth of freedom. I have to see that I see no signs so far of democracy being born in Iraq. Conceptually, the problem is the contradiction of trying to force people to be free. That was Robespierre's mistake in the French Revolution of 1789, and it proved a shortcut to horror. Because the fact is that